So I'm not sure how many of you know where Bell, California is, or what type of unbelievable corruption occurred in this small town. But if you don't, you will tonight. As a former county executive, I was really drawn to this scandal, so much so that I actually did some research and ended up writing a book. But I'm going to start this story with an email exchange that I uncovered during my research. Note, there are no private email exchanges on public servers. And no matter how many times you hit delete, they don't delete. So let me set the stage for this email exchange. The email exchange is between Randy Adams, who is the police chief in Glendale, California, with Angela Spaccia, who is the assistant city manager, assistant administrator in Bell, California. They refer to a guy named Bob, and Bob is Robert Bob Rizzo, who is the city administrator of Bell, and all three of these are kind of the main characters in this scandal. So Randy Adams gets the final contract because he's getting ready to become the police chief in Bell. And he asked Angela Spaccia why the term pay period was not defined. And here's the email exchange. Angela, we have crafted our agreements carefully so we do not draw attention to our pay. The word pay period is used and not defined in order to protect you from somebody taking the time to add up your salary. Randy Adams, I'm looking forward to seeing you and taking all of Bell's money. Angela, LOL. Well, you can take your share of the pie just like us. We all get fat together. Bob has an expression he likes to use on occasion. Pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. So as long as we're not all hogs, all is well. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow. Public corruption is broadly defined as putting public interest above the public good in a public setting. On average, there's been about 1,000 convictions a year of bribery, fraud, perjury, and theft. Now, the overwhelming majority of public officials are decent, honest individuals, but that's a fair amount of corruption going on. So given the routine corruption that's occurring in the United States, why was this small East Los Angeles city of Bell worthy of a book? Well, this was no routine corruption. This was no ordinary failure of governance. What emerged in Bell was a truly astonishing amount of wrongdoing, one that the district attorney in Los Angeles succinctly described as corruption on steroids. Now, Bell is a 2.81 square mile municipality of 35,000 residents just southeast of downtown Los Angeles. It is one of the poorer of the 88 cities in LA County with an average annual income of $28,000 a year. About 90% of the residents are Latino, and a large portion are undocumented. In the spring of 2010, two Los Angeles Times reporters were in the adjacent city of Maywood covering a story. It was interesting, Maywood just laid off all of its employees. They got a tip. You know, some of these characters next door in Bell are making a hell of a lot of money. You need to check it out. What ensued was a Pulitzer Prize winning series by the LA Times that uncovered this astonishing amount of corruption, orchestrated by Robert Bob Rizzo, who was the city administrator, and his assistant, Angela Spaccia, the assistant city administrator. At the Times, it was reported in the LA Times is Bob Rizzo was bringing $800,000 a year salary. But that wasn't the full story. After they did an investigation, they found out with retirement benefits and other perks, he was actually making $1.5 million. Yes, you heard me correctly, $1.5 million. Now, Angela, for her part, was making about $850,000 in total compensation, and Randy Adams, who we saw in the email, had negotiated a salary of $457,000, 50% more than the police chief in Los Angeles, for a total compensation of $770,000. Four of the five city councilmen were making $100,000 a year for this part-time gig, far more than the $400 per month that was allowed by California. All the while, the tax burden, the property tax burden of this low-income community went to the second highest in LA County, higher than Beverly Hills. Now, The narrative around this story of how this corruption could have occurred included that a lot of the citizens were just disengaged. There were 4 or 5 individuals going to city council meetings. The other reason is the LA Times and other media stopped covering most of the cities. Revenue advertising was down, the recession hit, and no one was really covering the day-to-day transactions. But that didn't tell the story. And I was really kind of interested in 2 more fundamental issues. One is that how did this corruption occur in a city with a form of government, the council manager form of government, that was designed to combat corruption by hiring professionally trained administrators to run the city? And unlike other corruptions that have happened nationally, how is it that everybody was involved? The auditors, the attorneys, the elected officials, employees, the police, the unions. Everyone that could have done something, should have done something, was either complicit or burying their heads in the sand. Well, in looking at these questions, I looked at it from 4 different frameworks, and I'm just going to share 2 of them with you. And one is this notion of geographic contagion. It's a relatively new area of research, and what researchers do is see whether corruption, like a contagious disease, has can actually move vertically through an organization or actually from region to region. Now, it's assumed you have to have a basic level of corruption for it to spread, but researchers have been able to uncover that, yes, indeed, it can be contagious and move from region to region. Now, it seems to diminish as you move further apart. But in the past 2 decades, it's been interesting that all these towns around the issue of Bell, Cudahy, Huntington Park, Linwood, Vernon, Maywood, several water districts have all been involved in pretty massive corruption scandals. The second area I kind of looked at is this concept of revenue extraction. Now, the theory goes is that some public officials are attracted to municipal corruption because of their ability to extract wealth from cities or from the municipality. When it's done illegally, it's known as graft. Now, a powerful limit to municipal corruption is the ability of the wealth to leave the city. A corrupt public official needs to have the wealth to extract, and they don't want it escaping. Now, during the progressive era, 1890 to 1920, cities survived a good deal of corruption in this country because the corrupt officials were balancing the issue of investing in the city while they were doing some graft and removing wealth. Some theorists refer to these as stationary bandits. And a stationary bandit is one that does a lot of economic development in the city. At the same time, they're extracting some of the wealth. The danger becomes when the stationary bandit becomes a rover bandit. And a rover bandit is only interested in the short-term horizon, only interested in extracting dollars. Now, what we did find is that under the administration of Bob Rizzo and Angelo Spaccia, as they more and more looked like a house of cards, they were just interested in extraction. And extract they did. As I mentioned before, is that property tax was a major funding source for municipalities in California, doubled from 2006 to 2010. They ran all the businesses out of town, except for gas stations, by shaking them down. They issued a bond 7 years prior for a sports complex they promised to citizens. It never came to fruition, but it did provide short-term cash for Rizzo and the councilmen to use for a host of illicit activities. But what I found is probably the most insidious part of this revenue extraction involved the issue of their vulnerable populations. What they did is they used code enforcement and police stops to impound cars. Similar to what the Department of Justice found in Ferguson, Missouri, I actually had the police sergeant point out to me the type of cars and trucks that they would stop. They would typically be Latino. They would have paint or lawn maintenance materials in their truck, because the assumption is that they stopped them, either they were undocumented or they had a family member that was undocumented, and they would be less likely to challenge the citation and the subsequent impounding of cars, which, by the way, was 3 times the rate of Los Angeles. At the height, they were impounding about 8 cars a day in this small town. A lot of these transactions, were cash. And so we really don't know how much money was actually extracted from the city. So when did they determine this actually occurred? Well, somewhere between 2003 and 2005. But Bob Rizzo was actually hired in 1993. And when he was hired, he was actually credited with saving the cash-starved city. He instituted some sound fiscal measures. He restructured some of the bonds. And, citizens actually said they felt safer. The parks were cleaner, the trash was being picked up really quick, and graffiti was actually removed in a very efficient manner. It wasn't until 2003 that they actually start documenting some of this stuff. Actually, it's when he hired Angela Spascia. But let me go back to that decade. What Bob Rizzo was actually doing is planting the seeds. He was planting the seeds to what happened. He started dismantling the check and balance system in a council manager form of government. He started co-opting individuals. He bullied individuals and removed them. When citizens asked, he lied to them. He started just creating this incomprehensible form of governance. In 2003, he hired Angela Spascia. It's kind of interesting, is during the investigation, the trial, Angela and Bob turned on each other. Angela basically said, I'm just following the direction of my boss, the city administrator, where Bob's team basically said, Angela was really the brains behind the operation, particularly since she designed a lot of the illicit retirement scheme. Well, when Angela was originally hired, she was called the assistant to the city administrator. Then she got promoted and became the assistant city administrator, which made her a public official, which led to her conviction. Titles matter. In 2005, what really kind of crystallized is Bob convinced the city council to have a special election and become a charter city, to escape some of the oversight of the state of California. They had a special election, 1% of the electorate voted, the majority of them absentee, and it passed. And then what Bob did is that he gave himself and Angela a 50% raise. 50%. Now, they notified the retirement board, CalPERS, that oversees the retirement, which should have been a red flag. It wasn't. And the only reason CalPERS didn't have the obligation to pay off the retirement is because Bob never took it to the city council for approval. Because Bob stopped taking anything to the city council. He just started improving himself. By 2008, he had given himself 143 hours of annual and sick leave. Now, you could only work 250. For Angela's part, from 2003 to 2010, she took off 1 year twice, 2-year periods. One time it was actually tragic. Her son, an aspiring hockey player, was involved in a motorcycle accident and she had to take care of him for a year. The second time she had to take care of her ailing parent. But during the trial, the assistant district attorney asked Angela, why does she feel that taxpayers should be on the hook for paying her for 2 years when she didn't work and didn't do anything? Angela's response was, that's a good question. I never really thought of that. Bob created phantom agencies to hide his salaries. There was 5 different agencies. So if you ask him how much he made as city administrator, he said $180,000. But he had 5 different agencies that met simultaneously with the city council. He also ran a loan program. Yeah, a loan program that almost all the city employees took part of, and they used their collateral, sick and annual leave, to pay off the loan on a biweekly basis. The mayor participated. Actually, one of the attorneys he hired at $1 million, but that's a whole separate story, participated in this illegal scheme. What he did is he created this incomprehensible form of government. If you wanted to follow what was happening, you couldn't. The budget, the 5-year budget, I oversaw a budget of $6 billion. I know a little bit about budgets, and I could not understand what he was doing. I couldn't understand what was being approved. He virtually had no written rules and procedures. It was incomprehensible. When citizens asked what was going on, he lied to them. When staff challenged him, like the staff attorney, he bullied them. Now, I could go on and on because the book is replete with scandalous detail after scandalous detail. Some more juicy than actually been talking to you about. But justice did prevail. The grand jury ended up indicting Bob Rizzo and Angela Spascia and 5 of the mayor and 4 of the councilmen and a former council person. Bob Rizzo never ever talked. When he was subpoenaed, he took the fifth. He actually pled to 69 counts of corruption and received a 12-year sentence and an $8.8 million restitution fee. Now, it was interesting because he had some really good attorneys. And the attorneys basically begged the judge to convict him on tax evasion. See, because while Bob was extracting money from Bell, he was raising thoroughbreds in the state of Washington. And so they got him for tax evasion. And if you know anything about going to prison, if you go to prison, you'd rather serve your time in federal prison with white-collar crime than some of the rough and tumble people that end up in state crime. So part of his sentence is actually served in federal in Santa Barbara, he is right now. Well, Bob never talked. Angela talked and talked and talked and lied and lied and lied and went to trial, and she didn't fare much better. She ended up getting a sentence and being convicted of 11 years and 8 months and having to have $8 million in restitution. 4 of the current city councilmen and the mayor were convicted. 1 was acquitted, and 1 former city councilman was convicted. They served anywhere from 4 months to 5 years, with some being suspended, with varying amounts of restitution. Bell is digging out. See, some good work as attorneys, they actually recovered $28 million that went back into the city coffers. They hired a city administrator who was professionally trained and ethically sound to help put some of the structure back in Bell. They elected some really good public servants who are trying to build the trust again with citizens. So, how do we prevent Bells from happening? One, as I mentioned, is that we have to have engagement. People have to be engaged. Pre-corruption Bell, there were 4 or 5 people attending meetings. Post-corruption, and I attended several of these, it was not uncommon to have 80 to 100 people at those meetings. They're watching everything that's happening. The second is that we have to have the media there. There is too much complex transactions in city government not to have someone following it on a day-to-day basis. The demise of print media and other type of media outlets is a tragedy. We need them involved in local government issues. You know, maybe these issues of disincorporation, incorporation, or sharing services need to be looked at. Do we really need 88 cities in LA County? And does every single city have to have their own police force, their own fire department, and their own parks department? Maybe if we had some sharing of services, we'd have a different oversight. And maybe we need to look at the council manager form of government. Maybe the new city manager is the new boss. Maybe they have too much power. You know, but in the end, talks about government structure and regional arrangements really fail to satisfy. As noted before, there were several broad trends that made Bell vulnerable, some beyond their control. But if they set the stage, these factors, all it took was someone with the right credentials and the wrong motives to come along. And unfortunately, bad motives, willing cronies, and vulnerable populations are not in short supply in LA County or nationally. That's why the story of Bell needs to serve more than just a warning, a case study. It needs to serve as a warning. I mean, after all, is that it's all really about us. We need to be engaged in what's happening. We need to ensure that and support media outlets to have good coverage of what's happening in our government. We need to demand transparency, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable. Oh, and by the way, Randy Adams, who we talked about at the beginning, was never indicted and was never convicted and is living a good life. Thank you.